So today I'm going to talk about some of Barbara Guest's early poem paintings made with the German-American painter Ilse Getz, so that's Guest and Getz. I will reflect briefly on Guest's collaborations with women artists in particular as a formative aspect of her approach to poetic composition, as well as being a way that Guest cultivated her own creative community. It is interesting to note that there is little published evidence of poetic collaborations between Guest and her male New York School poet contemporaries. This is not to discount the ways Guest writes alongside and in conversation with these poets, nor her friendships with them, but this did not really seem to extend to published poetic collaborations. Guest's relatively isolated position as the sole woman in the quote-unquote first generation of New York School poetry is mirrored in Kimberly Lamb's assessment of New York School painting as a quote notoriously and unabashedly masculinist, allowing women in only as singular exceptions. While Guest did collaborate with male artists as well, her collaborations with women artists, whether in the form of books incorporating visual forms and text, or poem paintings, which for me I understand as singular works on canvas with painted text, suggest her enduring interest in finding ways to bring her work into dialogue with women artists. So according to the photographs and slides in Guest's papers, the poem paintings that she made with Ilse Getz were done in Getz's Paris studio in 1963. There are some slight variations with the dates, so early 1960s, most likely 1963. There's not much written about these particular works, so I found we can understand something of the composition of these works by turning to a conversation Guest had with another painter, Mary Abbott, who she also collaborated with on poem paintings. In a 1975 discussion held at the University of Minnesota, Abbott and Guest discussed their collaborative methods. Abbott recounts how she and Guest worked together in 6-hour blocks, freely associating across text and painting in a mode which Abbott refers to as absolutely simultaneous. Sorry, it's a bit of jet lag. Quote, we worked for hours and hours. She'd say something, I'd paint, then I'd cut it off, then she'd say something and I'd paint again. It really was a collaboration. It was not illustration. I was not illustrating Barbara. She was not writing about my paintings. We were absolutely together. In the talk, Guest foregrounds the freedom that this method of collaboration engenders. She says, what painters give to poets, they give us freedom. For Guest, the successful, unforced and unhurried collaboration, quote, and this is, I think my title has slightly misquoted this, it frees you, it frees her, and it frees me. This freedom relates to composition modes which foreground process and materiality rather than the final form, an approach learned from painters who Guest said know about the laws of accident and the laws of chance. Finally, the freedom also extends to the physicality of the act of composition, which Guest calls what Guest refers to as the physical joy of painting, an activity which can be done standing up and moving around, not hunched over a desk. And in the talk, she actually mentions that when she was drafting her novel, Seeking Air, she wrote that standing up, and that standing up freed up the prose and helped prevent stomach problems. Guest and Abbott amusingly compare the reciprocal freedom of their collaboration to other instances of collaboration between New York School poets and painters. When an audience member asks them if painting over the words in the poem paintings obscures the message, Abbott replies that she thought her painting made it double, and Guest affirms, you were really good at that, before sharing an anecdote about Larry Rivers and Kenneth Koch, who, quote, were having a real ego struggle. Every time Kenneth would write a word, Larry would paint it over, you know. He'd just get so angry. He'd say, listen, you don't need that word there. What do you mean you don't need that word there? The picture is about words. He said it's not about words, it's all about pictures. Guest laughingly concludes that she and Abbott didn't have that trouble because she's so modest, only to be interrupted by Abbott asserting her own modesty. The comments are light, but draw a clear contrast to Guest and Abbott's collaborative mode, which builds allowance and reciprocity. This is affirmed too when they discuss the fact that Guest painted some of the text onto the canvas herself, Abbott says, "I asked her to speak and then I asked her to write. When Guest protested that she didn't know how to use Abbott's paintbrush, Abbott replied, 'Barbara, just use it, you know, don't worry about it.' The image of the poet using the painter's tools is further evidence of a willingness to blur boundaries of medium and control over the work." The associative spirit and sense of collaboration as a shared duration and open space for the work to unfold permeates the collaboration of Guest and Getz as well. These are abstract works which emphasise the material pleasures of language, paint, and in some cases found objects like textiles which have been incorporated into the compositions. The airiness and blank spaces in many of the works and the absence of conventional figures or landscapes foregrounds the text, suggesting too that something of the page has entered the painting. This work, Kachu, is a bubblegum tone composition of playful slippage and repetition. The work dabbles in a knowingly constructed courtly femininity, an aspect found elsewhere in Guest's poems. The courtly dart, I hope you can see it at the back, the courtly dart is mirrored in At Curtly Heart, while courtesy becomes or can be understood as a curtsy. For me, even the more directly sonic exaltations, flim flam and pam pam, convey a kind of coquettish impermanence. The only phrase left singular is the titular sneeze, the final exclamation following the tickles of the doubled phrases, evocative of other kinds of pleasure. Several shapes resemble handkerchiefs here, perhaps to catch the sneeze or as tokens in a courtly ritual. And so these ones are, there's some photographs of these works, but these ones are actually taken from slides, so they're not the best. But in this work, Lemon Grove also uses textile forms, with Guest poem painted around 4 yellow and white spotted pieces of cloth, dropped and held in place by thick white paint. There's a breezy, abbreviated pastoral tone to the text. Lemon Grove, consult your yellow book. White door, hen house, yolks, sun up, field mice. I can find a hint of Williams's White Chickens, but I also return to textiles and stage femininity and hear a snatch of pop music about a yellow polka dot bikini. This is perhaps an unintended resonance, but one not entirely at odds with the courtly pantomimes hinted at in Kachu. In another work, On the Road to Ruin deals with not the woman in the pop song or the courtly lyric, but instead the female hero in the form of Joan of Arc, who was burned at the stake in Rouen. Her execution is perhaps the cloud in the poem. I don't know if you can read the text there. On the road to ruin, a message arrives from the cathedral. Daylight begins with a cloud, afterwards the rainbow of Joan is the text in that work. So Joan's execution is perhaps the cloud in the poem, also suggested in the plumes and smudges of white and grey paint. The collection of vertical lines evokes the road as well as the rainbow of Joan, a kind of image of enduring legacy. The exploration of the hero as a classical figure and the positing of the woman artist as a kind of hero is also explored by Guest in the kind of cross-media dialogue that she had with the painter Grace Hartigan across a series of lithograms and poems which interrogate the construction of the classical hero. Sorry. Guest's poem Heroic Stages is dedicated to Hartigan, and Guest emphasises the heroism of the woman artist who is thought to be disappearing under the desperate monuments of sand, but emerges triumphant in the final stanza. You face a park, there are wings in this atmosphere, sovereigns who pour forth breezes to refresh your atlas. Sarah Lundquist suggests that Guest and Hartigan, individually and collaboratively, appropriate the iconography of the hero. They broaden, adapt, personalise, and in some instances, feminise it. And Heroic Stages recognises the daily heroism of a commitment to artistic vocation. I know I'm whipping through these a bit, but I'm conscious of time. The final Guest and Getz poem I want to mention is The Walks of St. Cloud, first composed in French, but actually quoted many years later in another collaborative work that Guest did with a Bay Area artist called Laurie Reed called Symbiosis. So Symbiosis was published in 2000 by Kelsey Street Press. And when the poem appears in Symbiosis, I'll read the text. The walks of St. Cloud are open, the eyes of the fish are closed, remarkable basin, you give me 10 years. So it's here in French, but in Guest Archive there's also a photograph of this work with the text, and then this is how it appears in Symbiosis. The subtle green of Reed's drawings, I'll pass this around later, suggests the movement of water, emphasising the slightly surreal fisheye vision at work in the text, perhaps as much the fisheye of the lens as the fish itself in the poem, who in reality cannot close its eyes. The revisitation of the Walks of St. Cloud in Symbiosis, almost 40 years from its first appearance, signals the enduring significance of collaboration to guest writing practice. The reappearance is an important instant of making visible the history of collaborative practices and of countering what Bette London refers to as the double invisibility of women's collaborative practice, in which collaborative practice itself and its female practitioners have been historically positioned as minor. When it appears in Symbiosis, the first line is, she looks at a poem painting. So a female viewer looks at the poem painting. Thus we get a female viewer, perhaps Reed, encountering one collaboration between women, which is in turn contained in another collaboration between women, printed by a women's press. In one moment, a historical map of Guest's lifetime of formative and productive collaborations with women artists. Look at that.